Welcome back to Live with AI Virtual CES 2022, a webcast series that focuses on ADAS and autonomy with today's leading industry experts. At the same time, we're also doing virtual demonstrations of AI's Foresight LiDAR, a software-centric and solid-state solution that can adapt and optimize its scan patterns in real time. All of our CES broadcasts are being shown live across AI's social media channels and will be archived later on AutoVision News. Joining us now is Keith Dierkx. He's a member of the AI Advisory Board, and he's an international railway and logistics expert. Keith was formerly global markets leader for transportation, freight logistics, and rail and mobility at IBM, where he established a rail innovation center in Beijing, China. Prior to IBM, he was the senior vice president of IT for one of the largest maritime terminal operators, where his team led the digital transformation and automation of terminal operations. Now, Keith is deeply linked to the startup and innovation communities and currently advises and mentors a number of companies. He has been a frequent speaker on the digitalization of the supply chain and the use of transformational technologies to enable improved business outcomes. Keith, so glad to have you on the program today. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be on. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So Keith, I want to pick your brain here just as we begin. What are some of the biggest breakthroughs in rail and logistics when it comes to autonomous technologies?
You know, it's interesting, and it's happening very broadly, Carl, across all different modes. I mean, one of the interesting things that when you say, you know, freight, logistics, transportation, it's really 20 or 30 different industries. So, you know, what we're seeing now is a lot of development around autonomous vessels. So, you know, and we've been hearing about all these supply chain challenges, whether these are you know, big container ships or there's a project now, I think it's called Project Mayflower, where the use of artificial intelligence and autonomy is going to transverse the Atlantic Ocean, being able to do that. Autonomous trains in the mining industry is already in place, and they're doing more and more of that. And of course, we've all heard about autonomous trucks. You know, electric, and how that's progressing. And in fact, you know, Richard Bishop, who I think you've talked with earlier, you know, spent a good deal of time talking about the truck market, but it goes beyond that as well. So, you know, we're thinking about things like container handling equipment. You had mentioned about my bio in the maritime industry. You know, when I think about location, condition, and health of containers within a yard, automating those container handling devices, if you will, with GPS, LiDAR is coming into play, IoT devices, things like that. And then, of course, automated warehousing, you know, whether that's forklift technology or distribution systems, cross-docking. Autonomy is very much a focus and goes hand in hand with a phrase I like to use, which is resiliency. And as we talk a little bit about kind of the conditions that we're in today, how much resiliency has come to the fore in supply chains.
So Keith, with that in mind, what can we expect, say, throughout this year? Maybe, well, what can we expect in the next 1 to 3 years then?
Well, it's interesting. I was reading something in Railway Age, and Chuck Baker, who is the president of the American Short Line and Regional Rail Association, he was doing some advising of the bipartisan infrastructure law, Carl. He was asked for comments on that. And of course, he talked a lot about automated track inspection. He talked about automated crew size. He talked about the DOT. You know, spending as much time working in the rail information around transformation with autonomy as we're seeing in the trucking industry, and being able to do that. So, you know, it's top of mind from a lot of the organizations and from the government as well. But I think, you know, what we're going to see to some degree is more of the same, which is ubiquity in the use of sensors. So when you think about Internet of Things devices, you think about IoT, you think about GPS and you know, global NavSat systems, LiDAR. All of these things will be you know, both advancing in terms of you know, the cheaper, better, more resilient, being able to do that. I think the other thing that we're going to see is advances in sensors that are multi-use, that are adaptive, that are configurable. It's very difficult to plan for every use case. So whether that is a hardware configurability or using software that's driven by AI and machine learning, being able to adapt that device for different use cases, but without having to have 100 different types of devices. I think we're going to see more and more use on that. One of the things that you didn't mention in my background, I was with an IoT startup in the Valley.
Okay.
And I think one of the challenges for the widespread use of the Internet of Things was that you would need a specialized device and a specialized capability for each use case. So what we're seeing now is the technology permitting this idea of being able to reconfigure and dynamically change the use case and the business case of the device itself. I think we're going to see a lot more automation. We're already starting to see that because of COVID. With some of these automated delivery devices, little bots that are going down the sidewalk and delivering your pizza or whatever have you. We see companies like Verizon and Amazon and UPS and others looking at drone technology. So, what I think is, more and better of the same. And of course, always focused around the use case and the business benefit.
Right. And Keith, that was my next question here. And I had visited with, your colleagues as well, about how COVID and the supply chain shortage, how that's affected trucking. But, you kind of mentioned it there, but how has COVID affected rail? I mean, we're 2 years into a pandemic now. What do you see from your vantage point?
Yeah, so let me answer that by stepping back for a minute. So
Sure.
One of the things that COVID has exposed is that optimizing, if you're a railway, a trucking company, a port terminal operator, a container shipping line, that optimizing your particular space in the supply chain isn't enough.
Okay.
There really needs to be a concerted effort from end to end. So when you think about, something manufactured in China, going then outbound to the port and the terminal on a container ship into LA, Long Beach, being picked up by a truck or being on dock rail, the trains moving those containers and being able to do that. Optimizing just my space isn't enough if there are challenges that each of those other components are having. So, we've heard about, 40 to 60 container ships, offshore in LA, Long Beach, being able to do that. Or another great example, there was talk from the administration about running 24/7. Well, if a ship and a berth runs 24/7, but the warehouses, the distribution centers, the cross-dock facilities, if they don't run 24 hours by 7, then you're not really gaining any advantage by working because there's nowhere for that truck to go. There's nowhere for that container to go. So this idea of, managing the supply chain in concert, I think is going to be a big part of that. So rail will be a part of that. I think that, there's a couple areas where COVID's impacted. It's impacted the shipping lanes. And because of, e-commerce and other things, the traditional flows of the supply chain of goods and services has changed dramatically. And that leads to shortages. So that might be a shortage of a truck chassis. That might be a shortage of a container. I was in a webinar a couple of weeks ago and we were talking about this. And it's this idea of dynamically reconfiguring the supply chain, going from brick and mortar to e-commerce has caused lots of challenges. It's caused, the interconnectedness of the supply chain, as I mentioned before. It talks about labor shortages. Okay. So, I need fewer people selling in a department store, but I might need more people in a fulfillment center being able to do these kinds of things. Sure. And then, of course, with COVID being during a pandemic, what's the resiliency of my workforce? And I will say one of the things in a supply chain that is always a focus, whether it's rail, trucking, or other, is the safety of employees first and foremost is always paramount.
Sure.
And being able to do those kinds of things. So, material shortages, we've seen this, you're in, you mentioned earlier in the automotive industry is where you bring a lot of experience. And so chip shortages and other things, and a lot of finished automobiles, for example, move over the rail network.
Hmm.
But
Yes.
if you can't finish a car and you need chips that are either in short supply or somehow disrupted by the behavior of the supply chain, that's going to impact the rail industry as well. So, this again goes hand in hand with resiliency and autonomy and other things. Is how do I reconfigure a supply chain? How do I manage it with potentially fewer people? If not desired to be with fewer people, but by medical necessity, fewer people being able to do that. I think all of these things are, highlighting something that needs to take place in the supply chain, both today and in the future for events unknown.
Yeah, that great insight, Keith. Yeah, no, and you're right. The health of employees and and optimizing the supply chain. I've spent a good portion of this broadcast series that we're doing for CES learning about AI's adaptive LiDAR. And I think I have a pretty good understanding of how it works in trucking and how it works in ITS and especially how it works in automotive. But I'd like to get your perspective. How does AI's technology, how does that benefit rail and logistics from your vantage point?
Well, I think a couple things. I mean, so uh, I always tend to look at things, the value they drive is as a total solution. So that means not just the hardware, but potentially the software and the integration of both of those components into something that creates value. So when you think about LiDAR, for example, and the AI solution, the Foresight device, solid state, very long distances. And in fact, the field engineering team and I are on a call with a potential client in Southeast Asia that reached out to us based upon the, up to 1,000-meter distance that the AI device could have, being able to do that. I think the configurability. So when we think about using machine learning and artificial intelligence, throughout a journey, whether that's a truck or a freight locomotive or even a passenger train for that matter, there are going to be things of interest at different points in time as when I go through the journey. What does the vegetation look like as I'm taking the train through the Southwest? What is a grade crossing? Is there something that I need to be aware of? Is there, and we've already seen this, by the way, for safety reasons. The rail industry has been using LiDAR to map their assets for a safety system called positive train control. And they need the granularity and that level of detail in order to map out the journey that train is going to take with, a couple 100,000 pounds or more of freight associated with it, and being able to automatically slow down or stop the train and being able to do that. And LiDAR provides the ability to acquire enough data and enough information being able to do that. Having a single device, Carl, where I can change the region of interest that I have.
Yes.
So something near, what does the vegetation look like? What is the ballast or the railroad ties? Or at a long distance, what do I need to be made aware of based upon that? And I think of it in terms of a library, where if I'm going to send a train in motion out of the West Coast to ports, for example, to Chicago, those patterns may remain the same, so that I could automatically change the region of interest and the fields of interest and fields of view of the LiDAR device throughout that journey, specific to what I need to identify and be aware of.
So Keith, for folks like me who are in automotive, and I'm not the only one that that's like this, but sometimes we spend a lot of time just in our automotive box. And what's great about this program that we're doing with AI is that it's allowing an automotive focused person like me to learn more about trucking, rail, logistics, ITS, and things like this. So Keith, and all of your experience, maritime, rail, what can folks in the automotive industry, what can we gain by maybe paying more attention to rail and logistics? What are some key takeaways that us in automotive can learn from your industry?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think the first thing, Carl, is there's going to be a lot of cross-pollination. Taking place and learning. So, obviously the dynamics of a train on a set of tracks is very different than being on a highway system, whether you're a truck or an automobile being able to do that. But what I have found through time is that and this is an interesting question. You mentioned earlier that I had set up an innovation center in China
Right.
at one point. It's interesting. The rail industry, when I speak to executives, they often don't want to understand what's innovative from other railroads. And the reason they don't want to is they don't need to.
Oh,
That
yeah.
they're very aware of what their peers in the industry are doing. What they're really interested in is what's a best practice, what's a capability from another industry where they might not be aware of that, but it is something that might be applicable to their industry, but hasn't been implemented, hasn't been used, or hasn't been developed for. So, you think of something like, the LiDAR and the AI total solution, this ability to change, regions of interest and zones of awareness, if you will. That is something that certainly is going to translate into the rail industry as being an added benefit. Right now, it's hard to say what the rail industry is going to teach the automotive industry.
Sure.
I will say that because they've been running automated trains for the last couple of years, certainly the LiDAR companies are taking all of those practices, and that's being infused into the product and the solution offerings that they have for other industries. So if you think about the industrial sector and mining and other things, there very well might be lessons there that they've learned about, rather than having crews. What are the things that need to be aware of? What were the surprises? What did they anticipate happening that didn't happen, or what did happen that they didn't anticipate? So I think it's going to be interesting to see. I think the resiliency of the systems, the hardware and software. Rail is a very difficult environment. So I think that if you can withstand the rail environment, anything that the trucking industry or the automotive industry throws at them will be, I think easily is the wrong word, because nothing's easy in this
Sure.
in this business, but I think there'll be a lot of lessons there. I think the other thing is the use of AI, and I see AI in two ways, right?
Okay.
And when we think about levels of autonomy, 1 through 5,
Sure.
I think of AI as both artificial intelligence and augmented intelligence. So AI in terms of the patterns that I'm going to learn in training the models, but also augmented intelligence. So how is it that I'm going to assist with the driver while we have the, that process is still being developed around the safety guidelines that are needed and the assurances of safety. The culture of the automotive industry, you would know better than I, like the rail industry, is one of safety first.
Yeah.
Be able to do that. So, I know that's a little general, but I think that I guess the recommendation I would make is for both industries to open up the aperture, look at what each other are doing, and find those aha moments that can then inform the development of the next generation solutions for either.
Right. And this is why, Keith, it's just to speak personally, this is why it's such an opportunity for me to be part of this CES broadcast, because when I first came to AI, I learned how the company was inspired by its aerospace background. So then I saw the crossover, insights that I could glean in automotive from the aerospace industry, and then talking to your colleagues, trucking and ITS. And, after our conversation, I won't look at a train the same way ever again. So I like that I'm able to, yes, it certainly is a general assessment, but there's a lot of key takeaways there for automotive folks. And that's one of the things that always has drawn me to AI. There's all these different backgrounds: aerospace, automotive, there's, rail and logistics. There's all these different focuses to create, or to help facilitate future mobility. Right. And that's one of the most exciting things for me anyway. So Keith, as we wrap up here, I wanted to cover just one thing in your bio. So you have experience with digital transformation and digital supply chain technology. So what does a digital transformation look like? What do digital supply chain technologies look like?
It's interesting. There's a lot of companies, and you had also mentioned that I work with startups in Silicon Valley. So
Yes,
there's a big focus. And by the way, 3 or 4 years ago, supply chain was interesting, but not the most interesting thing,
sure.
right? Because I think, Carl, we took it for granted that
I
it was
think
just
so.
going to operate and that it was going to work. Now, over the last couple
Yeah,
3 years, we found that it hasn't. So
it
I
hasn't.
think there's a couple things. One is more data and more information is always a better thing.
Mhm.
And by that, I mean, it doesn't always mean that the result you're getting is what you anticipated or would desire, but a positive result or a negative result is information and then informs you in terms of next steps. So I like to think of it as this digital transformation as a continuum, taking data, turning data into information, information into insight, and
Right.
insight into wisdom or knowledge, if you will, and being able to do that. So, uh, how do I take and augment a human endeavor? How do I potentially replace a human endeavor? Being able to do that. Being able to use multiple modalities of sensor technology. I just finished a project in the rail industry about sort of next generation location and condition and health of rail assets. Certainly, when you think about that, it's not just the data, but what do I do with the data? How do I make predictions? How do I make different decision making? I mean, ultimately, when we think about digitalization, it's taking something that's not capturing the data in a manual way, being able to capture it through IT and systems, and then being able to apply machine learning, artificial intelligence, algorithms to it to get another outcome, potentially and hopefully better than what you had before, and being able to do that. So I think that, when we think about supply chains and resiliency, this whole digital transformation, I think, is pretty much the next step in supply chain. And then I would say beyond a single enterprise having that information from data to wisdom is the supply chain end to end having that knowledge, and where you bring together on each supply chain, each movement that takes place, all of the
Yes.
constituents with a transparency of information sharing.
Keith, this has been fantastic. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for being part of our CES broadcast today. Just thank you for joining us and sharing your experience.
Well, and I want to thank you. And, I don't come from the automotive industry, so my listening in on all of these sessions has been equally informative for me. And, I always do this as a way to steal really good ideas.
Yeah, likewise. Likewise. So we'll do this interview next year at this time for CES, and then we'll take a look at how things have evolved and changed in both automotive and rail, and then we'll share our collective insights.
That sounds great.
Industry experts from Harman and VSI Labs weigh in on the latest automotive trends and hard corner cases. That's ahead as we continue with our Live from CES 2020.